welcome to this month's FDTD Goes Applications webinar. This month, we're very happy to have David Levin, who's a meteorologist at the Forecast Office in beautiful Juneau. Next slide, he's going to be talking about issuing warnings with no radar. Next slide, please. This is part of an ongoing series that are listed here. We are always looking for topics. I'm Scott Lindstrom. You can send either me or Dan Bykos an email. Our addresses are listed there. If you think you have something that's good, we'll help you put it in the right format. We'll gather data for you. We'll do everything but talk for you. Next slide, please. Just some basics. This will be about a 20-minute talk, followed by questions. You can ask questions. You can wait to ask questions, or you can send them via the GoToChat. Most importantly, don't press hold, and mute your phone when you're not speaking. Take it away, David. Thanks.
All right. Well, first of all, thanks, Scott and Dan, for reaching out and allowing me to share this talk with everyone. I will say that this has probably been the most attention I've ever seen to a zero population severe thunderstorm warning. But June 27th was a very exciting day for us here in the Southeast Alaska Panhandle. As you might expect, most of the high-impact weather for Southeast Alaska occurs in the fall and wintertime. Summers tend to feature exciting forecasts such as, well, how far inland will the marine layer penetrate today? So convective scenarios such as what occurred on the 27th are pretty rare. Juneau typically experiences about one thunderstorm day approximately every 2 years. So we really miss thunder around here, especially if you come from the East Coast or the central part of the United States like I have. Definitely miss the thunder. Thus, getting to practice analyzing convective environments is not something we get to do on a regular basis. But as the forecaster on duty during the June 27th convective event, which featured Juneau's first ever severe warning, I thought it would be kind of fun to look back at the thought processes and analysis that went into issuing our severe warning based on some kind of unconventional means. So before we begin talking about the event, I thought it would be a good idea to introduce everyone to forecasting in Southeast Alaska. I was certainly not familiar with the challenges of forecasting in Alaska prior to starting my NWS career here in 2016. And I had lived my entire life up to that point east of the Rockies, so it was quite a culture shock for me to start forecasting in this place. Thus, it's important to kind of get a feel for some of the unique challenges associated with forecasting in the Alaskan Panhandle. Southeast Alaska presents kind of the perfect storm, no pun intended, of sparse observations and population. So we only have around 71,000 residents per the 2010 census in our CWA. 45% of that population is actually in the city of Juneau itself. So the remainder of that 71,000 is scattered across several smaller towns and villages. Very few towns have road systems that are connecting them to other population centers. So the main mode of transportation in the Panhandle is either by water or by air. Most of our observation sites are located near the population centers, although several villages actually have no source of surface observation at this time. And the vast majority of surface obs are near or at sea level, and few of those are at the higher terrain, so we really have very data-sparse regions. We are served by one radar, which is located along the central Gulf Coast and is affected by extreme beam blocking issues, which I'll show later. And then complicating things even further is complex terrain. So we have massive tidewater glaciers, we have millions of acres of temperate rainforest, narrow fjords, and close proximity of marine and continental air. So A lot going into forecasting for this area. I like to show this map when describing Southeast Alaska. This kind of puts it into perspective a little bit. We serve an area the size of the state of Florida, coastal waters notwithstanding. As you can see, the surface observation network is less than dense, and there are huge gaps in between observation sites where a lot of information is missed. Most of our observations, as you can see, are in towns or villages kind of along the coast or at sea level. And then up there in the kind of northeast part of the Panhandle is Juneau, and that's where our most dense OBS network is. In this case, the June 27th case actually happened in the far southeastern corner of our CWA in a very, very data sparse area. And initiation actually occurred over the higher terrain there of what we call the Misty Fjords region. One advantage of the convection occurring where it did was that we were in fairly close proximity to one of our two observed sounding locations, which was at Annette Island, Alaska, indicated by the black arrow there. The convection started firing right around 0Z or 4 p.m. Alaska Daylight Time. So we actually had a pretty decent proximity sounding from which to analyze the pre- and near-storm environment. The radar. So if only we had coverage over land. So remember the previous slide. Imagine a radar located in Tampa Bay serving the entire state of Florida, and then put a 4,000-foot wall of rock along the coast just east of the radar site. And then you probably have a pretty good picture of the Bjorka Island radar. In the picture to the right, you kind of see what we typically look at when a major front approaches from the west. We get great coverage over the Gulf of Alaska, but very little inland from the immediate Gulf Coast. So in the past, this has greatly limited our ability to issue convective-based products. However, I think as you'll see later on in the presentation, I think things are actually beginning to change. And lastly, complex terrain and land-marine interface also creates unique challenges to convective forecasts and also forecasts in general. The coastal mountain range there, kind of shown with the white caps along the eastern border of our CWA, rises from sea level to as high as 5,000 to 6,000 feet in just a few miles. Most of our towns and villages lie at sea level along narrow strips of land beneath mountain slopes. So you can see the two pictures there. One in the north there is Skagway, Alaska. You can see the town is just right at sea level, but very steep rises up to 5,000 feet on either side. And then the second picture is here in Juneau on a ridge overlooking the town, so you can see kind of the narrow channel there that Juneau is located along. So in the summer, most of the predominant flow regime is from the west, which leads to low-level flow from the Gulf of Alaska. This leads to kind of a moist air mass in place, but it's also cool and stable. But periodically we do get offshore flow from Canada during the summer. This typically leads to warmer temperatures, but also compressional warming and drying off the coast mountains definitely limits convection. So for us to get deep convection, we really need a Goldilocks type scenario for things to be just right. So for the event, I will say that this was a team effort all around. Our shift change time is typically around 3 p.m. Alaska Daylight Time, and the convection was really beginning to get going right around shift change time. So it was really crucial that our day shift correctly analyze the potential for thunderstorm development. Good pattern recognition is really key, especially in these low-frequency type of events. So the ingredients for Southeast Alaska convection were all present on the 27th. We had very weak offshore flow in the low level, so not strong enough to provide significant compressional warming and drying, but enough to keep the low-level marine air at bay. And we did actually have some shortwave energy that was forecast to drop south in modest northerly flow aloft. And more importantly, we had a thermal trough or a weak thermal low that set up along the coast mountains in the far southeast panhandle. So an examination of the 12Z RAOB data definitely showed that there would be instability present with a weakening cap given sufficient heating. So we got pretty excited. We actually really get excited around here when we see CAPE values over 250 joules, which is kind of sad, but that's what we get normally. Also, the GOES 17 mesosector was requested by the morning shift, which is pretty crucial for us. So this is the 12Z and that RAOB. This is the RAOB from the very southern part of the panhandle, which is shown in the previous map. We actually analyzed here a shallow elevated mixed layer from just above 850 millibars to just above 700 millibars. We don't really get EMLs that often in southeast Alaska, but occasionally they'll show up. We've noticed this during periods of persistent east to northeast flow as they kind of advect over the coast mountains from the higher terrain of western Canada, as long as they can survive the trek over the glaciers, which in the southern part of the panhandle is a little less of a problem. One concern was the weak subsidence inversion, which was noted there near 500 millibars. A little bit of dry air and a little bit of warming there. So we were worried that that might lead to some convective failure if there was entrainment of drier air. The CAPE was pretty skinny. So I don't know if you guys can see this loop or not. I tried to put this in here, but by late afternoon, we had a couple of mid-level features that we noted on the GOES 17 water vapor imagery. This is the upper-level water vapor channel. And most of these had an impact, I think, on kind of priming the environment for convection. So we had a little weak shortwave trough there shown just off the coast of the central panhandle there, denoted by the oval. You can maybe make out a little spin in the atmosphere. And also we had a weak shear axis or deformation zone that was set up right over the southeast panhandle. So we theorized that this probably led to cooling and moistening of the mid-levels and steepening the mid-level lapse rates that were lacking as we saw in the sounding below earlier. The mid-level flow wasn't very strong, and neither were these features, but the convection seemed to fire, as you can see there, right along the shear axis. So most likely the forcing for ascent was just enough to erode any mid-level inhibition that was present. And you can definitely see that here in the 0Z and at RAOB. You definitely see the convection was firing about this time. The sounding here shows a much more favorable environment for convection. The mid-level lapse rates were steeper, now as high as 7 C per kilometer in the 700 to 500 layer. The equilibrium level on this sounding is definitely a little lower than you would typically see here in the lower 48. The EL temp was around negative 58 Celsius. So one thing we have to keep in mind here in Alaska is there's a little less atmosphere to work with. So we had to adjust the GOES 17 IR color scale at this time to account for the observed equilibrium level on the 0Z sounding from Annette. The other thing to note there is that shallow sea breeze inversion. They're the very lowest, a few hundred feet of the RAOB. This is also very typical of southeast Alaska. So we're still capped here for surface parcels, even with temperatures at Annette in the 70s, which is kind of warm for southeast Alaska. Even though that was there, we still had over 1,400 joules of CAPE at the 0Z RAOB, which is pretty significant for southeast Alaska. Wind field was fairly negligible through the column, so we didn't expect widespread severe weather. However, given the amount of instability, we decided to investigate the environment a little further to see if we should be concerned about pulse storms. Oh, Let me go back. There we go. So again, I don't know if you can see this loop very well. This is the 1 minute goes visible loop from about the shift change time. But you can see here there's a stark contrast between the stable marine clouds over the Gulf and developing convection over the higher terrain there at the misty fjords. Storms seem to be firing near the thermal low that was analyzed over the far southeast panhandle. And we actually do have one surface lob in the misty fjords, which is actually in Canada, there at Stewart, British Columbia, which was coming up with a temperature dew point spread of 86 over 55, which is very, very toasty southeast Alaska. And sometimes, one observation is all you have up here. So we decided to modify the 0Z and net sounding for the surface temperature and dew point there in Stewart, British Columbia. So here's the modified sounding for the 86 over 55 in Stewart. And now you can see we have we have 1,900 joules of CAPE, which is uncapped, which is really high for our neck of the woods. Other things that we noted were a deeply mixed and dry boundary layer topped by a moist layer aloft. So a very weak shear and the mean wind indicating a slow drift towards the southwest, west-southwest for any storms that developed. We decided this is essentially a pulse-type storm environment with deep, high boundary layer favoring good evaporative cooling below the cloud base. So it was thought if we could really get a vigorous updraft going, there may be some strong downdraft potential. So at this point, we decided to have a forecaster dedicated to watching the 1 minute GOES data for any strong updrafts. As those of you that forecast for pulse storms know, it's hard to warn on those even with good radar coverage. So finally, by around 2Z or 60 Alaska time, we had several tall, skinny updrafts beginning to form just east of the Ketchikan area. Denoted by the yellow arrows. Using the modified IR color scale, we estimated that these updrafts were reaching close to the EL temperature on the 0Z and net sounding, with the potential for some overshoot as the IR cloud top temperatures were near 60 Celsius, negative 60 Celsius. There was some uptick in lightning activity at this point. We don't have GLM data here in Alaska, but we do have the Vizsla GLD 5 minute data with 1 minute update. So at this point, we were showing around 70 strikes per 5 minutes, which is pretty decent, but nothing to write home about. We began watching these more closely at this point, though, and definitely having the 1 minute GOES data was helpful in this case. The lightning was not too extreme, but we were watching for any updraft consolidation at this point. So here's the warning decision time. About 30 minutes later, we did finally have a vigorous and consolidated updraft that took shape just east of Ketchikan. Had a clear overshooting top based on our color scale there. Cloud top temperatures, the mins on the GOES IR channel were around negative 63 C, which is definitely overshooting the net 0Z RAOB equilibrium level there. Along with this, the GLD 5 minute data, and this is really key for us, showed lightning activity had increased dramatically right over the updraft, going from 70 strikes per 5 minutes to around 130 strikes per 5 minutes. I was unable to procure the webcam imagery, but we did have an FAA webcam site in the Misty Fjords, which was very near the path of this storm. We noticed earlier as the storm had passed over the camera site that some small hail could have been falling due to the whitish coloring in the rain shaft, although admittedly this is pretty hard to determine via webcam. Still, given the analysis of the environment, which we looked at earlier, and the marked increase in lightning activity near a consolidated updraft, which was confirming a rapidly strengthening storm, we decided to go ahead and warn on the storm. I remember looking at the lead forecaster on shift, and we looked at each other and just kind of like, well, the ingredients seem to be there, so I guess there really isn't a reason not to warn on the storm other than we don't have a radar. So we went ahead and pulled the trigger. I guess this would be a good time to talk about parallax and tracking the storm on WarnGen. This presented an initial problem when we were trying to get an accurate location on the storm, as well as get a realistic track and storm motion using WarnGen. If you look closely at the center of the GLD lightning data in the overshooting top, you will see there is significant parallax at play here. High latitudes, tall storms can give rise to large errors, so we kind of see that here. However, in this case, we actually had a tight concentration of lightning, which we assumed to be associated with the core of the updraft. So, given little in the way of shear, we assumed that the storm was generally upright. So, when tracking the storm on WarnGen, we basically, drug the point to the center of the lightning core, and then I was able to track that back a few frames. And that gave us a storm motion that was reasonable, southwest at about 15 miles an hour, although even that might have been a bit on the fast side based on the storm motion that day. Speaking of the radar from earlier, here's a glance at what we saw on radar during the warning decision time. Note that there's extreme beam blocking in the 0.5 degree scan, and that even if we were to have an unblocked image, the storm of note would have been on the extreme edge of the beam, so we'd probably be overshooting the storm anyway. The only thing really showing up on the radar is just some anomalous propagation there in the shallow marine layer off the coast there at Baranof Island. So really nothing to go on there when it comes to radar. So a short time after warning issuance, the storm continued to look fairly impressive. However, the lightning activity decreased significantly. It's unclear whether strong wind gusts were ever observed with the storm, seeing as how it passed over an unpopulated area, and we really didn't receive any reports from boaters who may have been in Beam Canal at the time. As the storm was beginning to track over the area near Annette Island and Ketchikan, the surface temperatures in these areas cooled further, so given the stable sea breeze inversion, we decided to let the warning expire at this point. So there on the left part of your screen, you can see the first ever severe thunderstorm warning issued by the Juneau Weather Forecast Office. I admit it was a bit strange typing satellite indicators into the source tab. However, that was really what we had to go on at the time. And this was really the only storm of consequence that evening, although several other smaller storms were noted across the southern part of the Panhandle throughout the afternoon and evening hours. So kind of wrapping things up, what did we learn from issuing our first ever satellite-based warning? I think really for us the key was pattern recognition and a thorough examination of the pre-storm environment. That was the key because it allowed us to better interpret what we were seeing on the GOES-17 and GLD lightning data. So I really can't stress enough the importance of the 1 minute data for us. For us that's like getting a complete radar volume scan every minute, if you think about it. So the day shift being proactive about requesting that mesosector in advance really gave us an edge. And then lastly, as always in data-sparse areas, such as the Alaska Panhandle, you really have to kind of put the puzzle together, so to speak. No one tool is really going to replace the radar. However, using 1 minute GOES imagery, keeping up with the latest in satellite science, using the lightning jump concept, and available observations and webcams, surface obs, all of these things in concert can make up, in some cases, for a lack of radar coverage. So really, I think the most encouraging thing that came out of this event was the knowledge that aren't really helpless anymore when it comes to convection. With the advent of GOES-17, not to mention some polar orbiter coverage from JPSS, it's actually possible to warn on potential severe weather in southeast Alaska for the first time. So I'd like to thank everyone for listening, and that is really all I have, unless anyone has questions.
Thanks, David. I will ask a question. What if you had not had the lightning data? How confident would you have been in issuing this warning, or would you have not even issued it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Hindsight is 20/20. I think we would have seen the overshooting top for sure, and seen the rapid development of the storm. But I can't say that we would, with confidence, have issued a warning without the lightning data, because I think the lightning jump was really a key for us in saying, oh, this thing is really, really rapidly strengthening. And it also allowed us to track the storm a lot better,
right.
With the parallax issues. So I think using the two in concert was probably key.
Okay. Are there any other questions?
Hey, Dave, this is Doug up in Anchorage. Just a quick question. Let me take that question a little bit further. What if you didn't have GOES 17? What do you think would have happened in the forecast office? In addition to the not having the lightning data, hypothetically.
I think, again, it would have been a lot harder to issue. I know the resolution is a little better in GOES 17, and also the temporal resolution with the 1 minute data. We were able to see things happen a lot quicker. So, with the lower temporal resolution of GOES 16, I just don't know if we would have gotten the warning out in time anyway. So definitely having that 1 minute data was crucial.
Okay, thanks.
Are there any other questions?
This is Ryan from Med.
I can just barely hear you.
Sure, I'm pretty close to. Hear me better now?
I heard you say now.
Stand by. Now. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Was this the first severe thunderstorm warning ever issued, or satellite-based issued?
To my knowledge, in the VTech era, this was the first warning ever issued by RCWA.
And I assume you got no reports. You don't know what happened up there.
That's correct, yeah. It was over a very sparsely populated area. It was possible, there were some boaters coming around from Ketchikan up into Beam Canal doing some fishing, or maybe some people camping or hiking, but no, we got no reports, and that's pretty typical for our CWA as well, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you.
Last call for questions. Okay, well, thank you, David. I really like this talk because it shows how important satellite imagery is, and I thank you for giving it.